Hello everybody. Welcome to the video, or I should say the first in a series of videos on Rahu and Ketu. This one focusing, and the next several ones I should say, focusing on Rahu and Ketu and how they are so deeply affected by their dispositors. Now I started by doing a poll on my Facebook page about what video you wanted to see, and I gave you a few choices based on some suggestions I had. The higher vote was for Rahu and Ketu through the dispositors, and I actually recorded it last night, and in the middle of recording it, I recognized how intricate of a subject it is, and I think because I work with it constantly, it seems like a simple thing to me, but then the moment I was getting into it, I was recognizing that there were so many different things that I would, in order to show you, would have to teach you at a very deep level. So I wanted to keep it simple rather than teach several different courses on techniques that help me to get to the root of the actual strength of Rahu and Ketu's dispositors. And also I recognized I would probably be doing a video, at least the first video, that was at least an hour in length. And I know how people in this day and age have a short attention span, and I've probably lost yours already, right? Probably not. So I figured it would probably be better to do several short videos on this so you can learn a little bit at a time. So this very first video, we're going to get into Rahu and Ketu, touching briefly on some of the particular houses they are in, either equal house. I also work with house cusps too, and sometimes I work with a little bit of both. The house cusps, also known as the Bhavachalita cusps, using a Campanus house system, if you're interested in knowing how I do that. So we're going to look at that. And first, let's touch on what Rahu and Ketu actually are, briefly. If you go back and watch the video that I did with Kapil recently, you'll notice I did a little bit of a diagram with my microphone, which is right over here. I'm not going to pull it out this time, though, where I kind of made believe that the microphone was the Earth. And we drew the path of the sun and the path of the moon to kind of give an explanation of the astronomy that creates Rahu and Ketu. And if you go and watch Kapil's video, I believe it's at about 9 minutes of the video. If not, if you scroll down on the comments, somebody put a really nice comment with a time in it. So you can click on that and it'll take you to the time in the video where I explain that. But just to give a simple explanation of that, Rahu and Ketu are shadow points. They are shadow points that actually create eclipses. You have the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun as it goes from solstice to solstice, and you have the path of the moon, which is about 5 degrees off of that path of the ecliptic. Now, where the path of the moon crosses the path of the ecliptic, the sun, as the moon is going north, right? When the moon crosses the path of the sun, that's called the north node. When the moon is journeying back south from our perspective and it crosses the plane of the ecliptic, that's called the south node, or Ketu. North node is also Rahu, south node is also Ketu. Just giving you an idea of the nodes, why they have the name, the north node and the south node, so you understand that. But Rahu and Ketu have no actual physical presence. They are just points, shadow points. That's why they're called shadowy planets, because they create shadows. The only physical representation we have of them is when we have an eclipse. We can see the eclipse if we're on the right part of the planet where the eclipse is visible. Other times of the year, we cannot see Rahu and Ketu, but we can see Jupiter, we can see the moon, we can see Saturn, we can see Mars, pardon me, throat lozenge, Mercury, Sun, Venus. We can see all the rest of the planets, but we can't see Rahu and Ketu. So we look at that and the symbolism behind that, and we recognize that Rahu and Ketu really have no form. So if they have no form, how can they have dignity? Right? They can't. They can't be in a friend sign. They can't be in a great friend sign. They can't be in neutral dignity. They can't be in an enemy sign. They can't be in a great enemy sign, right? Now, there's a concept that Rahu is exalted in Taurus and Ketu is exalted in Scorpio, and that Ketu is debilitated in Taurus, and that Rahu is debilitated in Scorpio. And I have noticed that Rahu does tend to bring better results when it's in Taurus, Ketu when it's in Scorpio. Worse results when Rahu's in Scorpio and Ketu is in Taurus. So there is some validity to that, but it's I don't know if I would necessarily call it exaltation or debility. So that's not denying that you can look at it that way. It's just more saying, since the nodes don't really have a form, they can't really have dignity. So the nodes, one of the things they do is they take the energy of their lords especially, and they channel that and create a play or a drama of consciousness on many levels that is played out in order for us to resolve our karma. Many people think of Ketu as relating to the past karma. It's also connected with what I like to call the security paradigm, what we've become most accustomed to over several different lifetimes. Rahu's function is to show us those places that need further development, right? Ketu represents where we have a strong foundation that we're most comfortable with, but perhaps need to evolve beyond. Rahu shows where we have a weak foundation that needs further development. So it is actually through Ketu and Rahu that we resolve a lot of our karma. So they act as energies that interact with the other planets and tend to, for lack of a better way to put it, focalize the energy of those planets so that we are facing the karmic resolution that Rahu and Ketu are all about. Okay, so that's just Rahu and Ketu briefly in a nutshell. So Rahu periods and Ketu periods are so utterly confusing because they are so involved with so many different planets, right? For instance, you have to consider the strength of their lord. Well, the strength of their lord may be in one type of dignity in one Varga chart, like the Rasi chart. But then if you look at something like the Hora related to liquid assets, the dignity might be a little bit different. Or if you look at the Dashamsha associated with great successes in career, the dignity might be different there. So Rahu can function well in one area of our lives and bring a lot of rise in one particular area and bring complete fall in another because of the position that it's in and the strength of its lord in that particular chart. Equally to take into consideration, we're not going to go into depth with this in this particular video, is the planets that aspect Rahu and Ketu. Especially if you're in a Rahu Dasha period, and let's say, for instance, you've got Venus creating a strong planetary aspect to Rahu, and you're in Rahu Venus. Well, even if, say, for instance, we had here, let's bring up an example. Maybe we won't use Venus, but just to touch on this point briefly, because a lot of people don't talk about this. Let's look at Saturn instead, right? Saturn gives a 50 rupa planetary aspect to Rahu. That's a pretty strong aspect because of the position between Saturn and Rahu. Okay, so that's a pretty strong aspect. So Rahu's in the sun's sign, so obviously it's affected by the sun, but it's also going to be deeply impacted by Saturn, especially if this person is in a Rahu-Saturn Dasha Antardasha period. So there's so many things that we have to take into consideration when we're trying to understand the effects that Rahu and Ketu will give. And that's why whenever people ask me that age-old question, how I have Rahu here and it's conjunct this, how is my Rahu Dasha going to be? I don't believe in answering those questions because I would ultimately be giving you an inaccurate answer unless I was looking at your chart, which is very multi-layered and goes into depth on so many different layers. There's so many things we have to consider. So for the remainder of this video, and it's going to be a brief video, and I promise to do one over the next few days, another brief one, and we'll do it little chunks at a time, we're going to take a look at Rahu and Ketu and the strength of their lords. And I just want to illustrate a simple point in this particular video of Rahu and Ketu and how they are affected by the strength or dignity of their lords, pointing out all the different examples. We may not get into Rahu and Ketu and the house cusp they conjunct. I may decide to bring that into it, but I just want to keep it simple for you, just to give you a concept and to illustrate a point, okay? So maybe we will touch on the house cusps. Let's use, for example, this is Jimi Hendrix's chart, okay? Ketu in Aquarius, past life or past security paradigm, whatever you want to call it, where there was the mental philosophy, this intellectual philosophy that if people, kind of all live as one, right, then that will, create security in the world, right? Or an intellectual belief that centers around being secure around one's peer group and believing that if one identifies with one's peers, then one is going to have more security, or having a past where one identified more with security through one's peers, right? That's Aquarius, right? And Ketu in the third house. It's just simple ways to look at that, right? This lifetime, if you know Jimi Hendrix's life, you'll find a lot of this was true. Rahu is in the ninth and in Leo. So rather than identifying with, group of peers, instead it's about him becoming individualized. In the ninth house, having to take a look at the things that he doesn't have any explanation for. He used to have intellectual concepts about how things worked, and he identified with a group of like-minded peers who probably believed the same thing. And this lifetime, he's having to become more individualized and define his own beliefs, his own philosophies, which are going to be put in a place where if he experienced Rahu Dasha period, and I haven't really seen if he had, nope, he would have experienced it in another, say, 6 years if he would have lived. But he experienced Ketu early on. I think he actually died in his Ketu Dasha. But, in looking at Rahu with that, having to define a new set of beliefs or a new set of ideals. So if we look at how that plays itself out, just looking at simple dignity, the best way to do this, if you know anything about the Lajjatati Avastas, which if you have Kala, that's what all these numbers are down here at the bottom of the screen. It's the way a planet has its Shadbala modified and how that is affected by planetary aspects or a planet being in a certain sign, a lot of different factors. If you don't work with the Lajjatati Avastas, you can also look at the planet's temporal dignity, the ruling planet's temporal dignity in a chart. The deep Tati Avastas also add a few other factors to that, such as a planet conjuncting the sun. But other than that, temporal dignity is very similar to what the deep Tati Avastas are. So you can read about that in Brihat Parashura Hora Shastra. You can also read about the Lajjatati Avastas there as well. Parashura did write about those. But just kind of defining it as simple planetary, temporal planetary dignity. So let's see, we're looking at the Rasi chart, which is the individual's path in this lifetime, right? Now, one thing I will say here before we go into planetary dignity, and we'll repeat this later on, is that the position of Ketu and Rahu in the Rasi chart, in other words, Ketu conjuncting the third, Rahu conjuncting the ninth in terms of the houses they conjunct, are going to bear themselves out on one level in all the Varga charts. So Ketu will have a third house agenda in every single Varga chart, the Hora, the Chaturtamsha, all of those charts. Rahu will have a ninth house agenda in all of the Varga charts, the Dashamsha, Dwadashamsha, whatever. It will have a ninth house agenda. In addition to that, it will also have various agendas based upon the planets that it interacts with, where it is placed in that particular Varga chart. All of those factors will have an influence as well. But you can pretty much rest assured that that particular agenda from the Rasi chart will play itself out in the other areas of life. Why? Because the Rasi chart is where the actual astronomy is happening, and the astronomy that's happening in the Rasi chart is getting transported over to the other individual Varga charts. Okay? So anyway, looking at the Rasi chart and looking at the dignity of Ketu and Rahu's lords. So Ketu is in Aquarius, ruled by Saturn. And we've got Saturn in neutral dignity because of the distance from Venus. Okay, so not the happiest of Ketus, because neutral planets can tend to bring feelings of scarcity with whatever the house cusp is related to, or whatever the planet is related to. Okay, Rahu, though, Rahu is in Leo with the sun in Scorpio in a great friend sign. So that's a good, strong, solid Rahu. So we're just touching on the simple dignity. So in terms of Ketu, in terms of that philosophy that, of finding security through like-minded individuals who have the same thoughts about how things work, that's a simple way to define that. Well, that's not bringing the same level of happiness in this particular lifetime, which is what forces him to become more individualized along the lines of Rahu in Leo, and forces him to define a new set of beliefs, right? Through Rahu conjuncting the ninth. And even though Rahu is going to have a difficult effect, because Rahu, that's just the nature of Rahu, right? He makes us focus on the things that are not developed. Rahu is going to play itself out with a slightly greater state of ease, and I create that quantified statement there, than Ketu will in the Rasi chart on the individual's life path. But let's take a look at some particular Varga charts and see how that tends to play itself out. How about in terms of career? We have Ketu in Aries, and how is Mars in the Navamsa chart? Mars is in neutral dignity. And you've got Rahu in Libra, which is ruled by Venus, and Venus is in a friend's sign, right? This is a specific calculation that is based upon the distance from a planet to its lord from the Rasi chart. So just to touch on that briefly, because Venus is in Scorpio, and to create the temporal dignity, we take the fact that the position of Mars is in the 12th from Venus, okay? And so Venus would be in a friend sign. So that's a better supported Rahu than it is a supported Ketu, much like what you're seeing in the Rasi chart, right? So in terms of his associates in career, it's not going to bring him the same level of happiness. So he tends to become more focused on his own beliefs, ideals, ways of looking at things in terms of music, in terms of his career, and begins to create a new artistic paradigm based upon that, okay? So that's through the Dashamsha. Finances, how does that play itself out? Let's look at Chaturtamsha, which is fixed assets, okay? So we're just going to do this short example tonight, and we'll look at some more examples in the next video, and we will also bring some other things into the equation. So I just figure it's best to keep it short rather than do one long video. Let's do lots of short ones, and I promise we'll keep them pretty regular, okay? So looking at Ketu in the Chaturtamsha, it's in Saturn's sign. And Saturn is in a great enemy sign because it's in Scorpio. So again, that's not a very happy Ketu in terms of fixed assets, things along those lines, fortune, okay? How is the sun? Well, the sun is in Leo, Rahu's in Leo, and the sun is in a great enemy sign because it's in Aquarius, okay? So neither of the nodes is happy here. So as it relates to finances, we can see that, Ketu period or Rahu period would bring a lot of problems with one's peers in contrast to one's own purpose as it relates to finances, right? And if we know Hendrix's life, he did have as any musician would, a lot of hangers-on, right, who were just there for the money and for a quick ride on the fame, so to speak. And he kind of fell prey to that more so than other people did, and it brought him a lot of unhappiness. How about we pick one more chart to do before we call it quits for tonight's example? How about the Navamsa Chart? Okay, in terms of committed relationships, what did that bring for him? Let's bring up this chart here too. We've got it here, but I can't click on the center of the chart here. So we'll bring it over here. I apologize for that. Here we have Rahu in Taurus, which one could consider it as being exalted, but really you're going to get more accurate results, I promise, if you play with this, if you look at the dignity of Venus in the Navamsa chart. And as we have Venus placed in Scorpio, again, it's in a friend sign. So that's a good Rahu, okay? He probably would have had a good potential of getting married if he wasn't already married around 2000, sometime in his Rahu Dasha, okay? Ketu in Scorpio. You've also got Mars in friendly dignity, right? So there were some lasting relationships in his life, right? With some of his associates. Some associates were, really committed to him in terms of his purpose. So he was able to find that on some levels. But in terms of when it involved money, then there were a lot of fickle friends who were just there to hang on to the money. But he would have been able to discern. And if you read some of Hendrix's life story, he did have some very close friends who did stay with him the whole time throughout that. Marriage was something that didn't really happen, right? He did have some relationships that were off again, on again, off again, on again, as would have been indicated through his Navamsa chart, and actually would have indicated that he would have had to work a lot on relationships. Maybe some of his relationships were more sexual by nature with Ketu's placement in Scorpio. On some levels, there's many more ways of looking at this too. I'm just kind of picking out some quick concepts there. But his relationships, in terms of committed relationships, would have worked fairly well. So let's look at one more example in terms of the Saptamsha. Okay, and then we're going to leave it at that, I promise. So Rahu is in Virgo in the Saptamsha, and Ketu is in Pisces, right? So we've got Jupiter debilitated here in the Saptamsha. And we've got Rahu, Mercury's Lord, great enemy, right? So this is why he didn't get married early on in life. The friends and connections that were committed stayed with him. The Saptamsha can show co-creative relationships, finding a partner one can really work with, amongst other things. It also shows children. So many things can be looked at through the Saptamsha. But let's focus on the relationship aspect here. So in terms of bringing committed relationships through the Saptamsha chart, well, because of Mercury being in a great enemy sign, it wouldn't have been able to develop for him during Rahu. During Ketu, associated with the third, Jupiter was debilitated, right? So really found a hard time. Here's several different ways of associating with this in terms of creativity. Another Saptamsha concept, leaving behind the legacy, he would have found a hard time finding associates, third house, that really kind of matched up to him. In terms of friendships, he would have found that he had some friends who came and some friends who went, many of which who were probably interested in him, as we have Mars there as well, because of the association with Fortune, which is a fourth house matter, and equally with Fortune, another ninth house matter. So this is just a quick way of looking at Rahu and Ketu through their dispositors. We're going to deepen this in the next video, which should be out in a few days. Just wanted to keep it short. So thanks for watching. So that's just the beginning of how we can look at Rahu and Ketu through their dispositors, through the dignity of their dispositors in this particular video. I'm going to do several more videos on this subject and Rahu and Ketu in general. You can look for the next one in a few days if I keep them short. I can do a lot more. And I also recognized if I did really long videos, I'd probably make it so that people wouldn't be able to watch it all, because let's face it, we all have lifestyles where many times we're not able to sit for an hour in front of a video, and teaching a good technique does take a long amount of time. So in the next video, you can look for information on the placement of the dispositor of Rahu and Ketu from Rahu and Ketu and from the ascendant, and how that impacts the experience of Rahu dashas and Ketu dashas. So thanks for watching, and see you in a few days. Bye now.